Good morning. Here we are, first adult faith formation class for 2026, and we are so glad to be back in the saddle, as it were. And we have such a good multiple lineups for the winter spring, and today we are kicking off the first series, a 2-week series, by Dr. Timothy Beal, one of my very favorite professors. No pressure, but it's just true. I've heard him teach for a long time, and I was so, that's so good. I learn a lot. So this 2 weeks is called In the Beginnings, Creation and Creativity in the Bible. Tim will be focusing on the first, well, I shouldn't give it away, but in Genesis. So and the Hebrew Bible, yeah. So Tim is a professor at Case Western Reserve University. He's a academic study of religion, although his doctorate is in Hebrew Bible. So he is a biblical scholar, and he loves to teach adult education in churches because he gets an opportunity to really do the Bible. So we're so glad you're here. I'm so glad you are in this space and doing this for us. So thank you so much. And if you'll join me in welcoming Tim, that'd be great.
Hi, everybody. It's great to see you all, and thanks for coming. A little higher. Yeah, okay. You hear me okay? All right, great. Great. Great to be here and to kick off the new adult ed year with you all and have some conversation around some biblical texts that, some will be more familiar and some will probably be pretty unfamiliar to you. And but I want to look at some different creation stories, some different stories that that try to imagine the creation of the cosmos, of the world, and to think about those as a way, to explore those as a way of thinking about creativity and the creative process. And maybe especially, it seems as I was preparing for this late last night and earlier and about a half hour ago, 15 minutes to be honest, maybe especially the relationship between creation, creativity, and chaos. With different ideas and images of chaos in biblical tradition, but what is the relationship between these things? It's something that comes up in the science of complexity and chaos theory and so forth as well, and there are some interesting resonances around that. And when I first started teaching, this became a really interesting theme for me as a professor. Back when I began, I started teaching this course called Ecology, Chaos, and the Sacred, really sort of wanting to think about ecology of chaos, ecology of order. There are different sort of understandings of ecology, whether it's ecology as a kind of homeostatic order versus the role of chaos and complexity in ecology and all of that. And then looking back into these biblical and other ancient mythospheres, story worlds, if you will, where chaos has a role, sometimes is personified, and oftentimes chaos is not demonized, but is actually identified with the divine, a kind of sacred chaos as well. So that's kind of where all that started many years ago. It's something that I've been interested in throughout my career, and I thought this was a good opportunity to explore some of those. So this is, by the way, an illustration. It's one of William Blake's illustrations from his illustrated Book of Job. It's actually a larger piece, but I needed to get a rectangle shape out of it. But this is Behemoth and Leviathan from the speech, God's speech from the whirlwind, from the storm there at the end of the Book of Job. And we'll talk a little bit about that in a minute. So just some introductory sorts of things for us to be thinking about, and I kind of already said this, but how is creativity related to chaos, whatever we might mean by that? the role of, sorry, that typo is there, the role of chaos in creativity, our relationship with chaos, God's relationship with chaos as well in biblical tradition. And this question, as I brought up a minute ago, of, is there a kind of a sacred chaos? Is the chaotic and the chaos, in biblical tradition, sometimes identified with the divine and with the sacred, other times over against the divine and over against the sacred. So those are some of the kind of big questions, and we'll come back around to them after we look at a few texts together. Some things for further study if you're interested. One is a book I did. It's just in its second edition now. It just came out a year and a half ago in a second edition. That's not too different from the first edition, which was in 2001, called Religion and Its Monsters. And that was where I really started trying to work this out in conversation with my students and talking about religion and its monsters on the one hand, the monsters that are there in religion, in biblical tradition and other religious traditions, and also the second half of that book is monsters and their religion, thinking about how horror and the monstrous opens up spaces for us to think about theology and religion in maybe somewhat unorthodox ways, in ways that maybe are not so welcome, in Sunday school, but that are really profound theologically to think about. So that was that book. Catherine Keller, Face of the Deep. Catherine Keller is a brilliant theologian at Drew University. This book came out a year after Religion and Its Monsters. There's a lot of resonance between it and my book. We did a panel together about that and so on, but really interested in developing what she calls a theology of becoming, or we might think of it as a theology of emergence, out of the deep, out of the chaos, drawing from these same biblical traditions. Adrienne Marie Brown, her name is spelled lowercase like that, a contemporary book, a new book called Emergent Strategies. Some of you might know Adrienne Marie Brown, and also her other recent book, Pleasure Activism, and she's not so much engaging biblical traditions, but very much resonates for me with this kind of thinking. And this is an old one, more than 100 years old. Hermann Gunkel wrote this book, and I just throwing it out there for context, Schöpfung und Chaos im Urzeit und Endzeit, which means creation and chaos in beginnings and endings. And what he's talking about there is a dynamic in biblical tradition where, on the one hand, God, in some stories, creates the world, creates a kind of orderly cosmology, ecology by pushing away the chaos, sort of barring it from overtaking that order. But then at the end, in the book of Revelation and other apocalyptic texts, what you sort of see is that chaos that's still there, just sort of pushed outside of the order of things, breaking back in. And so there's this dynamic between creation and chaos in both beginnings and endings. So just a little bit of context. So a little bit more about creation myths in the Bible and in the ancient Near East. That's the larger context of ancient Israel and Judah. Babylon, Sumeria, and all of these ancient Near Eastern really dominant empires. That were the context for biblical tradition. So just a few key terms before we dive in. And one is just cosmology, and that simply means a sort of understanding or logic of the cosmos. That word logos, logi, is related to order and logic and also speech. So cosmology has to do with a sort of an understanding of the cosmos in some general way. Cosmogony, G-O-N-Y, that's a little bit more technical term that we use all the time in biblical studies and ancient Near Eastern studies. Goni is, that G-O-N is the same as in our word Genesis. It has to do with birth or beginning, and so a cosmogony is a story of the birth or the beginning of the cosmos. Right? So that's what a cosmogony is. That's what we're going to be looking at today is several cosmogonies in the Bible. Chaos, we've already talked about that, but it has a lot of cultural meanings today, and what I'm thinking about in this context with regard to the biblical and ancient Near Eastern kinds of understandings, it's related to words like tohu as well as tohu vabohu. This is a phrase that's there in the beginning of Genesis that we'll get to eventually. Tehom, it means deep, most basically, but it refers to, in this ancient Near Eastern cosmology, to the sort of primordial, pre-order, that is to say, primordial, extraordial, primordial, chaotic sort of sea, like a kind of fecund, fertile, deep of watery chaos from which order emerges, and to which order can return as well, right? So that's that word tehom. We'll be coming back around to that in other contexts. And one of the things to think about is, why is chaos so often identified with water in these particular ancient Near Eastern texts? Chaos is also often personified in biblical tradition and in other ancient Near Eastern tradition. So there are chaos gods. There are gods of chaos and disorder who are often watery, sort of identified gods, like dragons and sea monsters and things like that, right? And in other mythologies, they are gods, and we'll talk a little bit more about that. Sometimes when they make it into the Bible, they're not sort of perceived exactly as gods anymore, but they're still kind of personified as these chaotic forces that can threaten the order of things, and so we can also call them monsters. But the point is that chaos is often personified in these different figures. Finally, another German word, Chaoskampf, which means chaos battle, chaos war, and that's the kind of term that we use to talk about a lot of these creation stories in which there is a battle between a creator god and a chaos god or a chaos monster or a force of chaos of some kind. And creation, the order of creation is established by defeating that chaos god. But one of the really interesting things about those chaos gods and those sort of figures of chaos that the creator sometimes battles against is they're still around. They keep coming back. Right? And so there's always this dynamic between order and chaos. They're intertwined in these texts. In this ancient Near Eastern context, there are a couple creation stories that, or creation, let's call them mythospheres, because one is a story and one is really a collection of poems that isn't exactly clearly a single story. But the first is called the Enuma Elish, and those are just the first two words in this ancient Babylonian creation story. In the Enuma Elish, just to give you a super brief summary of it, you have these original two gods, Tiamat, who is called Mother Timu, and her that name Tiamat is closely related to Tehom in Hebrew, and Tiamat is this sort of watery deep, personification of the watery deep. Apsu is her cohort, her partner, so there's Tiamat and Apsu, and they both sort of represent this sort of intermingling of chaos waters, right? They have these kids, these god kids, and eventually the god kids, including the hero of the story, Marduk, decide they want to kill their parents. And so the ultimate battle happens between Marduk, who is sent by the gods, who are all drunk and having a feast, to go and kill Tiamat. And it's this big raging battle between Marduk and Tiamat. And Marduk wins by blowing this big wind. It's very violent, blowing this, and misogynistic actually, blowing wind into Tiamat, and she blows up like a balloon, and he shoots an arrow, and she explodes. And then he makes the world out of her body. So he runs rivers and streams from her, tears, and puts half of her in the sky for the sky above and half below for the land, and goes on from there, right? And so this story of the creation of the world is a Chaoskampf. Marduk is pretty chaotic as well and pretty monstrous as well. But then Tiamat's always there, right? The world is essentially Tiamat, who might awaken, right? And so that presence of that chaos that's there. The other one is called the Baal Anat cycle, and this is a Ugaritic collection of poems. Ugaritic is very similar, is pretty much very, very close to Hebrew. If you can read Hebrew and you can convert the script, because Ugaritic was the language of what we call Canaanite language, and so it's the same exact context as the ancient Israelite context, right? And in these stories, I'll just, a couple things that are important to know, to think of right now, and I write about all these in that Religion and Its Monsters book, but one is that there are two, well, the main thing I want to highlight is that there are two sort of chaos gods in the Baal Anat cycle. And you know the name Baal, right? Because in some places in the Bible, it's prohibited to worship Baal or to create temples to Baal. That only means that they were doing it. You don't prohibit things that aren't being done, right? So, but at any rate, Baal is the sort of creator god, order god in this story, the hero. But there's one called Yam, and Yam, just spelled Y-A-M or Y-A-M-M. That is the word for sea, and it's also the word for sea in Hebrew, remember that. But it's not Ha-Yam, like the sea, it's Yam, like a proper name. So it's like a capital Y, Yam, and Yam is personified as this terrible, chaotic sort of figure in the Baal Anat poems. And the other is called Leton in Ugaritic. And Leton, does that sound like anything to any of you? Any monsters you might be more familiar with? Leviathan. So in Hebrew, Leviathan is Livyatan, and this is Leton, and linguistically it's easy to see how these two names are closely related. Another chaos monster, a kind of dragon figure in that cycle. Another thing to keep in mind, check the time. Yeah, we're okay. There's no single biblical version of creation. I said that in the little paragraph, and a lot of people don't know that, and it can really piss people off when you say that, because, well, I believe the biblical version of creation or something like that. Which one? There's a lot of them. There are two in the book of Genesis in those first 3 chapters that are very different from one another. We'll talk about those, and we have talked in past classes about those, but there are others as well, and we're going to look at some of those today. They're not usually complete creation myths, but they are sort of alluding to a larger creation story usually. They're resonating with one or another cosmogony and one or another cosmology, understanding of creation. Chaos is often playing a role in these. And they also often are connected to one another in interesting ways, and we'll try to tease out a couple little connections that I think are kind of fascinating in those. Finally, just a mention about mythological imagination. I don't think I need to tell you all that we're not worried about, and we shouldn't be worried about, some sort of a tension or conflict between modern scientific accounts of cosmic origins on the one hand, and biblical and other ancient Near Eastern accounts or myths of cosmogony, of the birth of the cosmos, of what a world is, and that sort of thing. These are, I like that word mythosphere as a way of talking about a story world. These are different story worlds, and the Bible has multiple different story worlds. Different mythospheres is resonating with different ones in different texts. This is not a book, but a library that we're talking about when we're talking about the Bible. It's a large collection of stories and poetry and so on that span many, many centuries and many, many hundreds of miles and lots of different cultural contexts. So we shouldn't expect them all to agree with one another. And myths are about world making. I forget who said it, but something along the lines of a myth never happened. A myth happens every day. So a myth is not an account of something that happened in the past. A myth is something that becomes real in your retelling of it, usually in a religious context, in your ritual reenactment of it. And so even something like, if you think about Rosh Hashanah, which means the birth the head of the year or the beginning of the year, it's a reenactment in many ways of the creation of the world. It's sometimes called the world's birthday, right, in Jewish children books and things like that. The reenactment of the creation of the world is the kind of re-sacralization, recreation of the world. So myths are about world making. They're about imaginative renderings of the cosmos. So let's look at some different biblical mythospheres, some different cosmogonic mythospheres. And we've got 4, and we'll look at them. Next time, Clover, we'll go back and look at Genesis, and we will just take a quick sneak peek at that this time too, toward the end. So, the first I'd like to share is from the book of Job, and this is at the end of the book of Job. If you've never read the book of Job, just you go and do it. It takes a couple hours. It's very amazing. It's a wonderful text and a remarkable, thought-provoking text in all kinds of ways. And this is the beginning of when God finally jumps in. Job's been arguing with his friends about things like, is the world, do we live in a moral universe or not? Do good people get blessed and bad people get cursed? Or is Job saying, is my situation sort of contradicting that, calling that into question? And Job's friends are all trying to defend God and defend the moral universe of God and all of that. And in the end, God finally just sort of shows up in the middle of this storm and speaks and really browbeats Job in a way, but then at the very end of the story, he sort of overwhelms Job with all of these images of the monstrous, of Leviathan included, that picture. But then, after doing that, turns to the friends and says, you have not spoken rightly about me as my servant Job has, right? So in the end, God, on the one hand, seems to sort of overwhelm Job with power, but on the other hand, Job was clearly onto something, because at the very end of the story, God says, Job is the one speaking rightly to me, about me, however you read that preposition. So that's the context. This is right where God jumps into the story. And I remember Martin Marty saying that the way you understand the difference between the way you identify a fundamentalist is that when God asks, where were you when I laid the foundation of the earth, or were you there? And the fundamentalist will say, yes, basically I do understand everything. But anyway, so this is the text. I'm going to read it. This is the beginning of it. This goes on through chapter 41 of Job, so it's a long speech with a little interruption in the middle of it. And when we're sort of mapping the rhetoric, we're looking for things that help us sort of see the shape of a text. We often will look for repetitions, and especially important in Hebrew texts often are these particles that are interrogatives, and that's what we have here. Me is who, and ma is what, and God is sort of jumping in with these questions. So I'm just going to read it, and in each case you've got questions. Were you there? Were you there? Who did this? Who did that? And then the when switches to the story that we're sort of trying to trace here. So, where were you when I laid the foundation of the earth? Tell me if you have understanding. Who determined its measurements? Surely you know. God is very sarcastic here. Or who stretched the line upon it? On what bases? On what were its bases sunk? Or who laid its cornerstone? When the morning stars sang together and all the heavenly beings, that's B'nai Elohim, shouted for joy. Or who I put brackets there because there's no who right there in the Hebrew. Or who shut in the sea, which is Yam, with doors, when it burst out from the womb, when I made the clouds its garment, and thick darkness its swaddling band, and prescribed bounds for it, and set bars and doors, and said, thus far you shall come, and no farther, and here shall your proud waves be stopped. Right? So there's the who, what, and then the when this happened. You have an image here, a cosmology here, in which you've got the sort of chaos waters everywhere, and you've got the foundations of the earth, and the earth almost like some, oil rig in the middle of the deep sea or something like that, right? Sort of laid out over these chaos waters, and something going down into the deep to establish a foundation for it, these bases and so forth. You've got a God who is sort of working with measures and lines to sort of set this whole thing up. But the dominant image here is a kind of a sort of platform of order that is surrounded around and beneath by these primordial chaos waters that are there before the creation of the world. So that's interesting. B'nai Elohim, translated heavenly beings, which seems like a little fudging it for me. B'nai Elohim means children of God, or most literally sons of God. They also show up earlier in Job. I was just thinking about this, that when they gather, and among them is Ha-Satan, the accuser. Not Satan, because it's not a proper name there. It has Ha, the, in front of it. But plays a role in this sort of divine court. And this is when the B'nai Elohim come to meet up with God and sort of talk about the state of the world. It's like God's cabinet or something like that. So these heavenly beings are there, right? They're there when God creates the world. God's not alone in this creation. It does not appear, for one thing. And here we get into a kind of chaos conf language. Or who shut in the sea? Who shut in Yam? That is bad translation here to call it the sea, because in Hebrew it's not ha-yam. That would be the sea, right? Definite article ha. This is just yam. That's a proper name, right? This should be capital Y, yam. It's probably the same. It's probably being imagined as something like the same as the yam in the Baal Anet cycle, right? This sort of personification of chaos that is the sea, as kind of the sea personified, if you will. And you've got this image of basically God, the creator God, holding Yam off, and even swaddling Yam, treating Yam like a baby, like a chaos baby or something like that, making the clouds its garment and thick darkness its swaddling band, and then prescribing bounds and setting bars and doors. Bars and doors are also in the Enuma Elish story, by the way, and saying you can't come past here, right? Holding back the chaos. But again, it's there. It's just outside those doors and walls, those bars, and above in the clouds and below, right? So it's all there. Is this a kind of order versus chaos sort of cosmology or not? We could talk about that, and maybe we'll come back to it. Let's look at another one. So I want to make sure I'm doing okay on time. So this is from Psalm 74. And again, this is not a full-blown story, but it seems to be resonating or assuming a certain kind of creation story that is different from Job, certainly different from Genesis 1 and 2, which we'll talk about later, and yet really fascinating. So Psalm 74 is what we call a psalm of lament or complaint. So it's a psalm in which the people, speaking in the first person plural, we are addressing God with a complaint or a lament. And the context for Psalm 74 is that the Babylonians have invaded and basically torn down the temple and desecrated it and are mocking the Jerusalemite people and all of this. And they are crying out from this desecration, basically saying, "Where are you?" And they use some motivating language like, "What are they going to think if you don't do something here?" And then the other motivation in this psalm is the psalmist remembering how God created the world. And in this story, the way God created the world was God defeated all these personifications of chaos, these monstrous figures, these chaos gods or chaos monsters, whatever we want to call them. And so this is where that kicks in, where the psalmist is recalling this creation, this version of creation. Yet God, my King, is from of old, working salvation in the earth. You divided the sea by your might. You broke the heads of the dragons in the waters, multiple dragons here. You crushed the heads of Leviathan. That's Leviathan with multiple heads, if you didn't notice that. It's interesting. You gave him as food for the creatures of the wilderness. You cut openings for springs and torrents. That's very like Enuma Elish. You dried up ever-flowing streams. Yours is the day, yours also the night, possibly an echo of Genesis 1. This too, you established the luminaries and the sun. You have fixed all the bounds of the earth. You made summer and winter. Remember this, O Lord, how the enemy scoffs and an impious people reviles your name. Do not deliver the soul of your dove to the wild animals. Do not forget the life of your poor forever. So, on the one, this creation story remembers God sort of establishing the world and establishing a kind of livable world order by destroying all of these chaos monsters, the dragons, the multi-headed Leviathan, feeding them to the animals. And is basically saying, you did that, Babylon's the new chaos monster, right? And you need to do the same again. You need to reestablish order. The social and the ecological, or the social and the cosmological, are very much connected here. Ecological, cosmological chaos is connected to sociological, political chaos, right? And Babylon is the political chaos monster, the sociological chaos monster. Just some notes about that. I already said it's a lament psalm. If you're reading this closely, you first notice it's all you, and then it recollects, all of the verbs of power tied to you, and then it switches to the imperative, remember and do not do, right? So that's the kind of rhetorical flow of it. Dragons here is the Hebrew tanin, and we'll talk more about that, but tanin shows up in a number of texts, sometimes translated sea monster, sometimes translated dragon, and into Greek, it usually gets translated drakon, which is Greek for dragon, obviously. Also, Leviathan is here. One thing we didn't talk about, but in Job, in the speech from the whirlwind, I've written a lot about this, God sings Leviathan's praises. Have you seen Leviathan? And as this sort of terrifying, chaotic figure. But God is really, it's like the last part of the speech from the whirlwind from Job is like a hymn to Leviathan about how amazing this chaos creature is. Here, Leviathan is an enemy. It has multiple heads, and God defeats it and kills it. In Job 41, it's this amazing creature of chaos that is alive and well and even terrifies the other gods. So that's an interesting tension. So, we talked already a little bit about some of the connections here with the Enuma Elish. Another connection, just to point out quickly, goes to Isaiah 27, and this is related to what I said about Hermann Gunkel and Schöpfung und Chaos in Urzeit and Endzeit, which is creation chaos in the beginning and the ending, because Isaiah 27 is a little bit like Psalm 74 insofar as it sees the Creator God as an enemy of the dragons and Leviathan as these personifications of chaos. But in Isaiah 27, it's not that happened in the past, it's that is going to happen in the final battle between God and the forces of chaos. And so you have this text, on that day, this is sometimes called the little apocalypse or proto-apocalypse in Isaiah 27. On that day, the Lord, with his cruel and great and strong sword, will punish Leviathan, the fleeing serpent. Serpent is Nachash there. Leviathan, the twisting serpent, and he will kill the dragon, Tanin, that is in the sea. Whether these are parallelisms and Nachash and Leviathan and Tanin are all the same creature, or whether there's a host of chaos monsters here, somewhat like in Psalm 74, is unclear, but it's being anticipated, like eventually you're going to do this and establish order in the world and sort of a recreation, of world order, but it's apocalyptic, it's in the future. And when we get to the book of Revelation, we could talk more about how these dragons and Leviathan sort of swim their way into the book of Revelation and become the red dragon toward the beginning of the book of Revelation, and also become Satan in the book of Revelation. That's Psalm 74 a little bit. Psalm 104, a very different understanding of Leviathan here, but a similar sort of creation story. This is a hymn of creation. Some of you know from Walter Brueggemann's work the idea that we have psalms of orientation, psalms of disorientation, and psalms of new orientation. So psalms of disorientation are lament psalms, complaint psalms, where you're giving voice to, where you're experiencing chaos and disorientation. Psalms of orientation are these kind of hymns where everything is right with the world before things go wrong and you find yourself giving voice to complaint and lament. So they're often like, sort of glorious celebrations of the order of everything. All is right with the world. And psalms of new orientation are usually psalms of thanksgiving that come after that context of disorientation. So you don't go back to orientation from disorientation, you go to new orientation. It's not orientation, disorientation, reorientation. It's orientation, disorientation, new orientation. You've been through the shit and you've experienced that chaos and you look at the world differently, and that kind of orientation is not the same as another kind of orientation. So I'm going to read this hymn. This is just jumping in a couple chunks of it. You set the earth on its foundations, similar to Job 38, so that it shall never be shaken. You cover it with the deep, and that's Tehom, as with a garment. The waters stood above the mountains. At your rebuke, they flee. At the sound of your thunder, they take flight, a little bit like Yam. They rose up to the mountains, ran down to the valleys, to the place that you appointed for them. You set a boundary that they may not pass, so that they might not again cover the earth. They're there, but we're hoping they stay there and don't come back. And then jumping to a little later, O Lord, how manifold are your works. In wisdom you have made them all. The earth is full of your creatures. Yonder is the sea, great and wide, Ha-Yam, great and wide. Creeping things innumerable are there, a little Genesis 1 resonance there. Living things both small and great. This is the part why I wanted to keep this part. There go the ships and Leviathan that you formed to sport in it. So similar to Job in some ways, similar to Genesis, which we haven't gotten to in some ways. But here Leviathan is like a plaything for God, is this creature that God splashes around with in the sea, right? It's a very different sort of image. It's certainly not Leviathan as a chaotic threat to the order of creation. This order of creation can handle Leviathan, apparently, right? Chaos is part of creation, maybe even we could say. And the other thing I just wanted to put a pin in is wisdom. Where is wisdom? I lost it already. Maybe I cut it too short. Did I lose wisdom? Second sentence. Okay, thank you. There it is. In wisdom you have made them all. So this word wisdom is in Hebrew chokmah. Chokmah is sometimes in the Hebrew Bible and in later Jewish mysticism as well, a personification of the divine. And so that's where we're going to take a look next at another cosmogony, or part of one. This is from Proverbs 8, and this is a speech from Chokmah, from wisdom. It begins 20 verses or so earlier, and it goes on for a while after this, but this is wisdom speaking, and you can ask, it's just figurative, it's really wisdom, lowercase w, and we're just sort of personifying here, or is it actually a figure? Is it a sort of character in the story? And I would suggest the latter is the case. But this is wisdom speaking. So I'm just going to read it. The Lord created me at the beginning of his work, the first of his acts of long ago. So not there before creation, but the first of creation. Ages ago I was set up at the first, before the beginning of the earth. When there were no depths, I was brought forth, depths tohu. When there were no springs abounding with water. Before any water and all of that from Genesis 2, before the mountains had been shaped, before the hills. So here mountains are getting shaped. That's interesting. We haven't had that. Before the hills I was brought forth, when he had not yet made earth and fields, or the world's first bits of soil. When he established the heavens, I was there. When he drew a circle on the face of the deep. That's alpane tahom, and that's a phrase that we have in Genesis 1 as well. When he made firm the skies above, when he established the fountains of the deep, tahom again, when he assigned to the sea its limit, so that the waters might not transgress his command, when he marked out the foundations of the earth, then I was beside him like a master worker, and I was daily his delight, rejoicing before him always, rejoicing in his inhabited world. So wisdom is there during the creation, all of the creation of the cosmos, the creation of the heavens, of the earth, everything before that. God is not alone in this creation as well. We have a context to keep in mind when we're thinking about a personification of a female figure who is a companion to God. In this ancient Near Eastern context, a lot of times a god would have a consort, a female consort, right? And so, in fact, there's a little archaeological evidence that this might have been something that happened in ancient Israel too. There's a piece, a little image that's been discovered. Forgetting the name of it, I should be careful. But what it says in Hebrew is Yahweh and his Asherah. And Asherah, in the Bible, they prohibit Asherah poles, which are some kind of an icon. But Asherah is a grammatically feminine name, and it's a female divine figure in the ancient Near East. And in that particular text, someone drew a picture of the Israelite God with that Israelite God's female cohort, Asherah, which is just kind of interesting. But it's relevant here because this chokmah does seem to be a kind of consort or companion in some way with God. The other thing that I think is interesting here is that when we look back to Psalm 104, it's possible that we could see a connection between Leviathan and Chokmah, because the language of delight and play that's there in Psalm 104 is also in this text here as well, which is just really fascinating and interesting. I'm not sure exactly what to do with it. So that's the fourth of those. This is just a sneak peek to next week, where we'll spend more time looking at Genesis 1. And we've got the King James Version and the Tim Beal version here on the left and the right. Some of you have seen I've written a translation of Genesis 1. It's my only published poem. I got it published in a poetry journal, which is kind of cool. But in the King James, in the beginning, God created the heaven and the earth was without form and void, and darkness was upon the alpane tahom, upon the face of the deep, and the Spirit of God, the Ruach Elohim, hovered or moved upon the face of the waters. So this is parallelism: face of the deep, face of the waters. Darkness upon the face, Spirit of God upon the face. Beautiful translation in many ways. This is a different translation. When gods began shaping skies, earth was bottomless brine, dark on deep's face, God's breath brooding on water's face. And it goes on from there. Just a couple things to know, and we'll come back into this later. I've already mentioned the face of the deep being that word tahom. Without form and void or bottomless brine, that is the phrase tohu vabohu, which is a kind of like helter-skelter. It has an onomatopoeia sort of ring to it, but it means the kind of primordial chaos. So it's another word for chaos there. So you've got both tahom and tohu vabohu in the text. How you read the first letter, we'll do more with this next time, but how you read the first letter of the first word of the first verse of the first book of the Hebrew Bible means everything. That first word in Hebrew is Bereshit, and Bereshit can be translated in the beginning, and that's if you read that first letter B which is a preposition as in, or with, or by, or something like that. But that same you can either read beginning as a noun, in which case the preposition is in the beginning. So if you read it that way, in the beginning God created the heaven and the earth that God just created was chaotic, right? So this is if you read it that way, you get a creation from nothing, a creation ex nihilo kind of story, right? First thing God does is create the heaven and the earth. That heaven and the earth that is created is chaotic. It's tohu vabohu. And then God starts turning it into some kind of order. But there's nothing there presumably before the heavens and the earth are created. If you read it as when, and you read reshit as a verb, began, not as a noun, beginning, you get when began, and then you've got when, let's just go with the King James Version, when God began creating the heavens and the earth was without form and void. Well, that means God is sort of jumping into the middle of things. When God began creating the heavens and the earth, that heavens and the earth that are there when God begins creating is chaos, is tohu vabohu, right? So if you read it that way, you get creation from chaos. If you read it the other way, you get creation from nothing. I would argue that in the ancient Near East, it's always creation from chaos. The kind of cosmology that is there in that context is one in which there is presumed to be this kind of primordial deep that everything, all kinds of order and ecology emerge from. Just a little sneak peek. Some questions for us to talk about. We've got a little bit of time. I just brought up the one. Is it really creation ex nihilo? Is it really creation from nothing? Or is it creation ex to home? Creation from chaos, from the primordial deep? I think is an interesting one for us to be thinking about. The intertwining, the intermingling, if you will, the entanglement, maybe, of creation and chaos in these stories, even in the ones that are the kind of chaos battle stories where the creator God defeats the chaos gods or the chaos monsters like Leviathan and the dragons, or defeats the waters, Yam, personified as sea, or primordial waters, and sort of pushes them out and bars them off and sets up doors and all of that. They're still there. They're still just right outside, the edges of order and under it. And there's always the possibility that they'll come back, that they'll break back in. That's what the flood story is in the beginning of Genesis, right? It's really could be understood as what the book of Revelation is describing. It's certainly what Isaiah is describing in the text that we looked at there, because they're back. Leviathan and the dragons are back, and someday in this apocalyptic vision, God's going to overcome them and defeat them again. But the world is full of chaos right now. So the interaction and intermingling and entanglement of order and chaos, of creation and chaos in all of these different contexts. The relationship between creativity and chaos, which I promised to talk about, and I hope that we will continue to do so. But just in our own lives, when we're thinking about our own creative processes, and when we're thinking about how do new things happen, where do they come from, I think that it might be more about emergence than chaos battle, that the creative process might be about leaning into that entanglement of creation and chaos, of order and chaos, and it might be closer to what we think about with chaos and complexity theory, this idea of complex order emerging from this sort of homogeneous primordial deep, and emerging kind of on the surface of that. And I think a lot of these stories do imagine that. I think that's how we should look at Genesis 1 when we go there next week. And I'm thinking especially about the book I mentioned, Adrienne Marie Brown's Emergent Strategy, because she's taking some of that kind of thinking from mythology, from science, and thinking about what does that mean for organizational behavior? What does that mean for leadership? What does that mean for community? What does that mean for activism and social engagement? And it's about sort of watching for and attending to the emergence of complex orders that we're not sort of in control of, that we're not sort of, designing and building, but we're participating in and attending to and facilitating in some way. So I think there's a lot there for us to think about. The big theological question for me that I write a lot about in Religion and Its Monsters is God's relationship with chaos. So on the one hand, we've already seen in some of these stories chaos and the chaos monsters, these personifications of chaos, Leviathan, Tannin, the dragon, the serpent, all of the Yam. It's God against them, right? They are the enemies of the Creator God, and the personification of chaos in them is God's enemy, and God creates order by defeating the chaos monsters or the chaos gods, right? So that's on the one hand, it's God against chaos. But on the other hand, we've got these other texts. We didn't talk about Job 41, where God is singing the praises of Leviathan and Behemoth, but we have these other texts where God is playing with Leviathan in the sea, where God sometimes takes on a persona of chaos, where God seems like the chaos monster. One could argue that the book of Job is about God out-monstering Job. Job thinks he's the monster, and God comes in at the end and says, "You think so?" and blows him away with this sort of monstrous vision of creation, right? So you've got this, what I would call divine ambivalence in the Hebrew Bible, in this library of texts about what is the relationship between the divine and chaos. Is it order and God on the one hand over against disorder and chaos, evil on the other hand, or is it something more complicated than that? And it's not resolved. You can't answer it. I think one thing that the book of Revelation does is try to resolve that by taking some of those different figures from the Hebrew Bible and turning them all into the red dragon who is the Satan, who is the devil and Satan, and I think it's Revelation 12, and then later in the story. But in the Hebrew Bible, you just have this rich relationship of the divine with chaos that's complex and unresolvable, and I think I would have to say resonates for me with my experience of reality and God and theology. And then the final question, what's with all the water? Almost always chaos is, whether it's personified as a monster or not, is very watery. And that's just an interesting thing. Catherine Keller has written a lot about that from a feminist theological perspective. She talks about how Christianity is tehomophobic, afraid of the deep, and identifies the deep and tehom with Tiamat with the kind of divine feminine, and a sort of understanding of creativity as this emergence, a becoming from that. So that's where I'll stop for now. Next time we will look a little more closely at Genesis 1 and do some more close reading. But this is some context for that, and hopefully that'll be fun next time. I hope to see you all there. We have a couple minutes or a minute, if anybody, yeah.
I would say 2 minutes. Right back here. So, what's with all that water and Noah, and all the water came back?
Right. Yes. Good question. And it's because the flood story. There are two different versions. There are two different flood story strands that are being edited together into a single one in those chapters in Genesis 6 to 8. But it's assuming the cosmology from Genesis 1, and these other ones where the waters are sort of barred and blocked off, and it says like the portals. God opens the portals. So you imagine, that Simpsons episode where the city is like covered in this glass dome? I always think of that. But the Shemayim, the heavens, which also Rashi said, so Sham means there and Mayim means water. So the word translated as the heavens can also be translated as water there. This cosmology in Genesis 1 imagines the earth here, this inhabitable world here, and the primordial deep under it and the primordial deep over it, above the ceiling of the skies. And what's happening in Genesis in the flood story is the chaos waters are being let back in. Yeah, and it could be that some of that language in Proverbs is alluding to that too, where the water is flooding over the mountains and all of that kind of thing.
I think we have one last question.
No, it's actually, it's probably a longer answer. This is fantastic.
Thanks.
But as you're opening my mind to the subject here, I'm thinking about the conflict between science, anti-science, the Scopes monkey trial, and the Big Bang Theory. Because in a sense, you're talking about the Big Bang Theory here. And so you don't have to resolve all of that today, but I hope you will next week.
Well, it might come up again next week. I promise not to resolve it, but because I don't think I can. But no, I mean, and some say, the Big Bang Theory is poetry too, right? There's something beautiful and mythological about, and imaginative about some dimensions of a lot of scientific understandings of cosmic origins as well. But yeah, there are resonances, and why that is something I don't know if I'm prepared to answer exactly. But when you look at some later Jewish mystical texts of creation, you'll find even more resonances. You've got this idea of tzimtzum, where basically everything gets so concentrated, and then it explodes, and that's the world. And this is a medieval story, medieval kind of cosmology, and the world is just all of these fragments, these shattered fragments from that concentration, the contraction and the expansion at the beginning of creation. A poetic rendering that sounds even more, that resonates even more in some ways. So on the one hand, I don't want to say, I don't believe that these biblical and ancient Near Eastern stories are meant to be scientific accounts. I really stand by what I said at the beginning about these are sort of imaginative renderings of the world, ways of understanding the world that we live into in their reenactments and their retellings. But I would want to say that a lot of great science is also poetic and imaginative, and not flat and prosaic, as we might want to contrast that. So it's a good question. Sorry, I don't have a good answer.
Well, I can't wait for next week. I know we're all excited for that. Thank you again,
Great.
Tim Beal.
Good. Thank you.